So we're now on to section 2, strategy and tactics of competitive bargaining. This is quite a long section actually, and it's not that difficult to understand, I don't believe, but we should move right along in terms so that we can get through it and take what we should out of it. I'm going to talk about bargaining terminology and concepts. That's very important. And it's not going to be just the conceptual, there's going to be quite a few tips in terms of how you treat some of these so things like resistance points and expectation points. Then we're going to get into the strategies and the tactics. Most of the emphasis will be on tactics, and we'll try to explain how the process works, and the underlying theme is that it's a lot of gamesmanship, a lot of deception, which may surprise you, but I think that's what much of competitive bargaining is all about. Anyway, let's move forward. Resistance point, we're going to talk about that concept. It's an extremely important concept, and it has real meaning in how you conduct yourself in competitive bargaining. We understand it's the bottom line, it's the walk-away point, the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And it's the point beyond which you're not going to be getting any value out of the whole negotiating bargaining process, in the sense that their alternatives will look better, the no deal looks better. And it's established, I guess a little bit of a definition, we should go into what resistance points are. It's established by the value, and value is a term we're going to look at next, that's expected. So it's a belief from a particular outcome, usually measured against the alternatives of a no deal or some other deal. I think we're trying to deal both with the concept of value and belief, and the alternatives is what goes into resistance points. Nothing really that's that difficult to understand. Value, what we want to get across here is its worth plus costs. So costs are a very important part of any determination, and this is really just the flip side of leverage. When you talk about the value that your client gets out of a deal, fundamentally that's your client's points of weakness in terms of leverage. That's why they need the deal. And what we emphasize, and we do a lot more of this in the second section, what leverage is all about, it's needs and tangibles and intangibles, and its avoidances or fears, also tangible and intangible. So it's a wide raft of different elements that go in that we call interest that the party gets out of this, both positive and negative. And on the cost end of it, it's the delay or difficulty in the negotiations and in aborting negotiations. Certainly aborting negotiations after you spend a lot of time at it and you don't get anything. It's something that enters into the value that somebody sees out of the process. So that's the resistance point. It's not something though it's theoretical. It's something that's extremely important in terms of when you go into both negotiate or bargain. And it's something as a lawyer, I think that you have a duty and obligation to your client to make sure that you've explored with him or her what the elements are of their resistance point. It's something that has to be the client's resistance point. It has to be something that you have to look at your client and talk to the client. For instance, if there's an issue of risk and tolerance and they don't want to do this, it's not up to you to impose your values on the client to make them think that that's what a resistance point is. And if you do that, what you'll find is that at the end, when you come up to impasse, the client will collapse and you'll be left alone as the deal moves forward. Anyway, it's very important to have a resistance point. It's also very important to work out the other party's resistance point, because their resistance point is really their leverage weaknesses. It's what they want out of the deal. It's what you have on them. And as you're going to see, as you go forward, you're going to try and work out strategies which are intended to have a settlement point close to their resistance point. So you should be working that through with the client, and also obviously it helps in the preparation. So it's something that's real and it's important. And I tell you, I see many negotiations, mediations, where I'm quite certain that their resistance point is being worked out as the parties trundle along, and they haven't come into it all set out in advance. The resistance points, this is probably where it gets most interesting. Resistance points get us into these zones of potential agreements because basically if you're going to have a deal or not have a deal, it depends whether you've got some distance between your resistance points. In the sense that to get a deal, the person who is paying money always has to be prepared to pay more than the person who's receiving the money. So basically, to have a positive zone of agreement here, you can see a plaintiff or somebody who's selling, somebody who's receiving, has to be prepared to receive less than the person who's paying, the defendant or the buyer. And if you don't have that, you don't have a deal. Hey, it makes sense. And so what I always talk about is having resistance points that cross, and to do that you have a positive settlement range. If you don't, then you have the negative settlement range, and basically to get a settlement, the parties are going to have to change their resistance points, or you're going to have to grow the pie somehow, which is when we talk about trying to find creating value as opposed to just taking it. But let's go back to this this diagram here, because the interesting question that flows out of all this is, where are we going to settle in the positive settlement zone? And you sort of think, well, is it going to be halfway, or is it how is it all worked out? And the reality is, it's worked out by how well you negotiate or bargain. It's up to the parties, because that's what's up for grabs. And I mean, just think about it. The plaintiff's prepared to go out at $75,000. So if you give more than $75,000, they will accept that, and they should see that as the best possible deal in certain circumstances. And similarly, the defendant is prepared to pay up to $100,000, so that if you get close to that point, then they're prepared to go as well. So obviously the strategy, which is quite evident from this, is you want to convince the other party to settle as close to their own resistance point as possible. And what that means is that you have to make them think that your resistance point is not where it actually is, but it's up near their resistance point, and you have to influence them, and you have to hide your resistance point. And that's basically what the strategy and tactics are all about, as we're going to go and see. But it does kind of put the emphasis where it belongs, which is on the parties that negotiate, and not negotiate but bargain. In negotiation, obviously, it's a little different approach, but that's where you are in competitive bargaining. You're trying to claim as much of that zone of potential agreement as you can for yourself, and it's based on your skills as a bargainer or a negotiator. So that should turn you a bit more competitive, or recognize that why it is a competitive type of activity, and why gamesmanship is so much part of what it is. So the settlement point, we want to say a little bit about the settlement point. It's the point somewhere where the parties settle, obviously. But where is that point? It's the point at which both parties believe that it's the best deal they can get. Now, we've already talked about the best possible deal. That's what competitive bargaining is about. But you have to bear in mind that it's both parties. If one party thinks that he can still get a better deal, that party will keep on bargaining. So it's both parties. And I guess the really important point here, and we're starting to emphasize this, and you're going to see it more and more, it's about beliefs. It's about beliefs where resistance points are. Which means it's about impressions and perceptions, which are things that you can influence and create. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's real. And in fact, in the end, when you think of it, most settlements, there's going to be a misperception as to where the resistance point is if they've given away something that is not right at your own resistance point. And even when they talk about best deals, when they talk about the perception, the beliefs about a best deal don't necessarily mean that it's the best deal that you can get in the future, that you can't do better in the future if you hang in there. That's not necessarily the best deal. And it's not about winning the process. It's not about getting one up on the other side. It's about all of those interests, all those needs and fears and costs that go into value, and basically assessing that against the alternatives and saying, yeah, I think this is the best possible deal that I can get at this time, based upon my understanding of what I think their resistance point is and my own. Anyway, so that's kind of the theory behind that, and I think it's tries to get across the importance of resistance points and working on them, and the theory of claiming value. Now, an equally, maybe even more important concept is the expectation point. And the expectation point is something that you bring into the negotiation yourself. It's the point at which you'd like to conclude negotiations, and we talk a lot about this in the second module, because in terms of mindset it's very important that you have an expectation point. It's also called a target point, but I prefer expectation point because an expectation point means it's something you expect to have, to a result that you expect to have, as opposed to a target point, which is something you'd like to have and aiming at. In any event, what you'll see is that when we get into the offer scenarios, basically bluffing in offers is to try and convince the other side that your expectation point, in fact, is your resistance point, so that they'll settle that at that point, which will be obviously close to their resistance point, and that's what it's all about. But expectation points are important, and we're going to say a lot more about them in the second module. We also talk here of one of the concepts a little bit, initial offer and asking price. We understand that. In terms of preparation, your initial offer is actually the last thing you're supposed to do, because really it sets the strategy. It means you've worked out all your strategy, and it's how you're going to put your strategy forward. And it usually has, in terms of what your openings are and what you're going to say about it as well. And why initial offers are important is that they're very often misunderstood. The rule out there, the general rule out there is don't be the first to make an offer, and in fact research shows that's not really the case in many instances. In fact, most often it's an advantage to make the first offer, because it has an important psychological role in this process called anchoring, whereby it sets a point around which negotiations take place. It's a very strong cognitive, irrational side of our brain, and it's something that can produce enormous outcomes. And so in terms of other mistakes that I see being made in terms of negotiations before me, it is around anchoring. It's somebody's given away too much at the start because they've basically bought an opening offer, a scenario as something that should set the settlement, the negotiation point around which negotiations should turn. And obviously, first offer, it communicates where you're coming from to a certain extent, and it contains some information, some influence, and we'll talk about that later on. The bargaining mix is just a package of interests, if you have interests. The only reason I put this in here really is that for each interest you should have, work out the same deal. You should have a resistance point, you should have an expectation point. And you also, of course, should be in a situation where you're trying to prioritize some of your interests and how you're going to balance one against the other, because that's what's going to happen in competitive bargaining. Is they're going to be trying to work one interest against the other to basically gain as much as they can the interest they want. And so there's a whole bluffing experience that goes around trying to make people believe that this interest is really your important interest when it's not your important interest. And we're going to look at that in what we call hardball tactics, but it's just a form of deception. But you should go through the same process of having a resistance point and an expectation point for all of your interests. So I think that's probably the conceptual side done, and you know, we've hit it, importance of resistance points, the ZAPA and the settlement point understanding. It's up to you to claim all that value that's there. The importance of beliefs and perceptions, which is where we're going to end up going and where the course obviously ends up, because influencing is all about beliefs and perceptions. And expectation points, the importance they have in mindset. I've introduced you to that idea, and the focus of bluffing. And settlement ranges and settlement points. I think I've already hit that one, so maybe that's a redundancy. Anyway, let's move on to